story. We have a complicated Gemara ahead of us, and we have to. Let's just go over the previous Gemara and see how far we can get. The previous Gemara, we had this story of Rav Hamnuna and Rav Chizda, and Rav Hamnuna recited the Bracha on the tamari before the remaining. The tamari means the date before the remind, the pomegranate. Rav Chizda was surprised because if you look at the pasuk that speaks about the greatness of the land of Israel and the 7 species that Israel is blessed with, what is the order of that in that pasuk? First, you would have remind and then tamar. First, you would have the pomegranate and then the dates from the, if you look at the verse, the last thing in the verse is dates. And Rav Hamnuna recited the bracha on the tamari first. And so Rav Chizda is surprised. And Rav Hamnuna explains, no. The reason I did this is because really tamari are supposed to come first. Not surprising. What I did was the right way to do it because you count from the word eretz. And because there's 2 eretzes in the pasuk, it doesn't go by the first word of the verse. It goes by the word eretz. Because it goes by the word eretz, so therefore, actually the tamari are the second item from the word eretz, and the remainim are the 5th item from the word eretz. So because of that, what should come first? The second item from the word eretz should come before the 5th item from the word eretz. And therefore, the tamarim, the dates, would come before the pomegranates. And that was the conclusion of the Gemara. And Taisus had this question, what happens if you have, see, because it says eretz twice, what happens if you have the 2 items? One is next to the first eretz and one is after the second eretz. Is there a priority among those items? Because they're both first from eretz. One's first from the first eretz, and the other one is first from the second eretz, because it says the word eretz. Eretz means the land of. The land that's blessed with these things. And so is there a priority when it comes to the, so for example, in the case that Taisus speaks about, you have chita would be the first item next to the first eretz, and you have the word, you have the food, zeis shemen, which would be olives. Olives would be the first item from the second eretz. So does wheat come before olives, or do olives come before wheat, or are they equal? And you could do whichever one you want. And Taisvis says that the first one, the first eretz would come before anything that's the thing that's closer to the first eretz would come before the item, the same number item in closeness to the second eretz, and therefore wheat would come before the olive. So that's Taisvis's example, and that's the answer that he gives, that it would go by, you would go by the first. These ideas of prioritizing brachas are brought in Shulchan Aruch. This is brought in Shulchan Aruch of which one you should recite the bracha on and so on. Now, there was an opinion we had earlier that the rabbis agree that you also keep the 7 species, and you keep the law of chaviv, having giving preference to the thing you cherish most. And the understanding was, according to that opinion, the understanding of the Gemara was that if you cherish both, then you go by what is more earlier in the verse of the 7 species. So for example, if you have 2 items that you cherish both the same, or you don't cherish both equally, you don't really cherish them. Then the priority would go by what is earlier in the verse. The 7 species would take precedence over other items, and within the 7 species, it would go by what's earlier. And so that view, if you take that to this story of Rav Hamnuna recited the bracha on the tamari, and he ate the tamari first. He ate the dates, and Rav Chizda was very surprised. Now, let me ask you, why was he so surprised? I personally like dates better than pomegranates, right? And maybe he did. Maybe Rav Hamnuna liked dates. Maybe he was giving precedence to what he cherished more, and that's why he recited the bracha on it. So you're asking me a question. What do you mean? Don't you hold about the 7 species? Yeah, I hold them. If I don't cherish them, then I go by the 7 species. Or if I cherish both equally. But here, maybe I cherish this one more. Why are you so surprised? I might have cherished this one more, right? It's a good question. In other words, there's 2 ways of learning. You can learn that the rabbis don't give precedence to the 7 species, only they give precedence to what you cherish. If you follow that, then the discussion here was following the other view, not the rabbis' view. Because the rabbis don't really hold to this. They don't hold to the 7 species. Rabbi Yehuda holds to the 7 species. And if you hold to the 7 species, so then they were discussing within Rabbi Yehuda's view, they thought they followed, maybe that was the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda, and they are discussing within Rabbi Yehuda's view, which Rabbi Yehuda doesn't mention the idea of preference to the thing you cherish. He talks about preference to the 7 species, and that story fits very well if you learn it that way. But if you learn that you're supposed to give precedence to what you cherish, so it could be that in this story, Rav Hamnuna cherished dates more than pomegranates. So how did they learn this story? So one of the commentaries explains that if you look at the wording of the story is that he recited the bracha on the tamari bereisha. He first recited the bracha on the tamari, on the dates. Now, what does that mean? It sounds like he's reciting the other bracha afterwards on the pomegranate. That's not true. You don't recite 2 brachas. It's one bracha. It's the same bracha. It goes for both. So why does it say he recited the bracha first on the tamari? So this commentary says what it means to say is that he took a bite of the tamari and he quickly ate the pomegranate right after. What was he showing when he did that? He was showing, I'm supposed to recite. It sounded like he really wants the pomegranate, but he's doing this because of some reason. The 7 species, maybe that could be the reason. Maybe that's why he's reciting the bracha on the date first. He thinks for whatever reason, he has some reason he has to recite the bracha on this, but really it seems like he really likes the pomegranate more. And that's why it says he recited the bracha on this first, meaning for a moment he ate took a little nibble of this thing. Then he really ate the pomegranate. So the story is saying that he obviously wanted the pomegranate. He cherished the pomegranate. So on that, they asked him, what do you mean you cherish the pomegranate? Why did you recite the bracha on the dates? The dates should come. And on that, he answered that dates really are first. The preference is the dates because they're earlier to the second word eretz in the verse. And afterwards, I'll eat what I cherish. So that would be the understanding of this of this opinion. That could be one of the explanations of how this opinion learns. Tosfos didn't like this way of learning because Tosfos thought this was a strong question. Why was he so surprised? What are you surprised about? He cherished the pomegranate. He cherished the date more than the pomegranate. What's so surprising? So Tosfos says he's not learning that way. He learns that this whole discussion is in the view of Rabbi Yehuda. But the other way of learning then you have this question that maybe he cherished dates more. And on this, one of the commentaries gives that explanation. So the bottom line is, what do we do in halacha? What is the accepted view in halacha? And this is where we come to the, we look in the Shulchan Aruch, we actually get to see how the codifiers of Jewish law, how they learned. Again, you might have many commentaries in the Gemara. Many commentaries explain the Gemara, but not all of them are necessarily accepted by the halachic codifiers of law. And so when you learn the halacha, you actually, if you know the Gemara before, you get to see how they actually learned it, which way of understanding it. So for example, this question of what comes first, when you have something you cherish, or you have something that's from the 7 species, which one would come first? Another question, another interesting point that I'm gonna soon bring this Shulchan Aruch, this Seder Berachas Hanenin, which is one of the codes of law. But before I do that, I'll just mention one other thing, that there are opinions that argue on this Tosfos. Tosfos over here says that the first word, that the chita, the wheat, would come before zayis, because it's closer to the first eretz. That would come before what's close to the second eretz. There is an opinion that says they're equal. So the chita or zayis are equal. And the same thing would be sa'ira, barley, and dates would be equal. That's another way of learning. That, in other words, in Tosfos's example, where you have an item that's close to the first eretz and you have an item that's close to the second eretz, Tosfos says the priority goes to what's closer to the first eretz first, and then you can do what's close to the second eretz. So he gives, if something is one word away from eretz, the first eretz, and you have something that's one word away from the second eretz, so the first eretz would come first, and then would come the second eretz. There is a view that says no, they're actually equal. You could do whatever you like, and therefore the two examples would be chita, wheat, and an olive, or barley and a date. Basically it would be, you would have the choice of what to do. Again, that's another view that argues on Tosfos. Yes, Ben.
I missed a couple minutes, so I'm not getting what the problem is between the dates and the pomegranate. They are both eights.
Yeah, but which one do you recite the bracha on and exempt the other?
Is that the one that you're holding in your hand, you mean?
No,
the bracha is the same.
Either you go by what's closer in the pasuk.
I understand that.
7 species.
How do we know which one he decided to say the bracha on?
The Gemara says the story of the Gemara was Rab Hamnuna had 2 food items in front of him.
Yeah.
He had the date. They brought in front of him dates and pomegranates.
I know they both eights. How do we know that he did the blessing on the dates?
It says.
He says, but how do they know?
How does who know?
Whoever wrote it, how does he know that it's on dates? Did he hold the date in his hand? Is that the difference?
No. The Gemara is repeating a story that happened.
Right.
This is a story that happened. That this is a tradition that they knew this story, just like they mentioned.
I still don't know how the story decides which one he say the blessing on. Did he say dates, or did he say priya eights? In the bracha?
No. They saw him chewing the date.
Oh, I see. So he ate first the date.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all I didn't understand.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So now if we take this to
I have Susan. A question.
Just 1 second. Susan, I think, was a second before you raised her hand.
Okay, go ahead.
Susan.
So you didn't answer. You said, so what comes first? What you cherish or the 7 species?
Right. Okay, we're gonna now look in the Shulchan Aruch. I'm gonna read a few things. That's not the only question we have. Yes, Robert.
I guess my concern is when Ben raised that point, is as if he's trying to second guess what happened there, and that's imponderable. You can't figure that out. So to me, the interpretation is very clear by what the commentary is, without going back hundreds of years to figure out who had what in his hand or his mouth. That's all.
No, but the story, it says what happened.
Right, but that's what I'm saying.
He was just wondering how they figured it out.
Yeah, well,
words,
do we know? Do we know?
Yeah, obviously they figured it out because they saw him eating it.
Right, okay, that's fine.
It's a very, yeah. No, but it's a story from the Gemara. Now, there are scenarios where, how does someone know about this if they never told, like you have stories where they never repeated this. So then how do we know, how did we ever get to know it? No, but that not in the Gemara. I'm saying other stories where like a rabbi said no one should ever repeat this.
And my thinking is we have to accept what's written because there's no other way to second guess the process.
Well, that's for sure. For sure, we accept what's written. Yeah, but I'm just saying, the logical thing is that they saw a meeting.
But the other thing is because there is a hierarchy in this line where wheat comes before olives and date. So therefore, my interpretation would be that because, as we have learned, when you have a sentence and items, products, foods are done sequentially, the one who is first is the one that has the priority for the bracha.
Right.
Unless there's dissension, which there usually is, but then we sort it all out, right?
Yeah. No, you're correct. And that's how Tosfos does learn.
Right.
Tosfos learns that something that's next to the first eretz, if it's the same number away from eretz, the first eretz would have priority.
It has less status the further away it is in the sentence and towards the end of the sentence. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So if we look in Shulchan Aruch, so first of all, we've learned about the case of we learned a while back about the case where you have a piece of wheat bread and a complete loaf of barley bread, right? Remember that case?
Right.
So here we mentioned that the proper way to do it is to put them together, and you cut from both of them together, or you recite the bracha at least on both of them together. And the reason is because one of them is a shlema, right? Because the barley is shlema, so you want to include that as well in the bracha, and it's like the bracha is on the shlema, on the complete one. Now then comes what happens. What happens if they brought two shleimos or two prusais, but one's bigger than the other? So you're supposed to recite the bracha on the bigger one. So we first talked about shalem, complete. Then we speak about big. And if one of the flours is more of a refined flour, then that also comes first, even if it's smaller. So refined flour comes before big or small. So it seems like complete, refined, big. That's the order so far. Now, what comes first, barley or spelt? Spelt is a derivative of wheat. It's considered in the category of wheat, but it doesn't mention it. So this we also got involved in, right? Because we mentioned that it's a type of wheat, and rye and type of barley. Now, what comes first when it comes to reciting the bracha on one of them? Should you recite the bracha on the barley bread or on the spelt bread? Which one would you recite the bracha on first? So on the one hand, wheat comes before barley, and this is a category of wheat. On the other hand, it doesn't say spelt in the Torah. It says barley clearly in the Torah. So what it says is, you recite the bracha on this barley first, because the barley, it says clearly, and spelt is only like in the category, and it doesn't say it clearly. Now, so then, now this applies if you like them both, you cherish them both. But if you cherish more spelt, then some say you recite the bracha on what you cherish, and some say you recite the bracha on the 7 species. In other words, whichever one is first. Okay, so now that deals with, it seems that there is an argument between cherishing and 7 species with regard to bread, that one of them is clear in the Torah, and the other one is only like within the category of one of the things in the Torah. And there we have a debate of if you cherish one of them more than the other, then, if you cherish the spelt more than the barley, but the barley would be more, the benefit, the quality of the barley is, the pro of the barley is that it's from the 7 species. It says it clearly. The pro of the wheat, of the spelt, is that you cherish it more. So here it says this, some say you do this, some say you do that. We have an argument. Basically, in that scenario, you could choose either way, because we don't have a conclusion which way to go. So you could either do what if you want to follow that way. Now, that's with regard to the 2 types of breads. Now we're going to jump to fruits. Now, if you have fruits that the bracha is the same, what should you choose first? What's important? So it says you choose what you cherish. Now, we're not talking about 7 species yet. We're just talking about you cherish one of them. You should recite the bracha on the one you cherish. But, however, what happens if the other one is complete? You cherish one, but the other item is complete. So it's the Mitzvah Minhammuther. It's a proper mitzvah. The best way of performing the mitzvah is to recite the bracha on the shalim. So what we're doing here is we're connecting some of the Gemaras that we learned earlier with the Gemara that we learn now, and trying to find out what would the halacha be, and give ourselves a little clarity of an area of halacha that most people don't know. And so what comes out here is you have 2 fruits. One of them is complete, one isn't. And you cherish one, you cherish the non-complete fruit, but the other one is complete. So it is a mitzvah minhammuther to recite the bracha on the one that is complete. Again, we're not talking about 7 species yet. We're just talking about 2 fruits, but one is cherish versus shalim. So what we're saying is shalim comes first. Complete comes first. Now, so if the brachas are not equal, now comes the next case. You have brachas that are not equal. So you go by the bracha first, and you say, well, ha'etz and ha'adama go before shahakal. So whenever you have items that are shahakal in front of you, you have items that are ha'etz or ha'adama. You recite the ha'etz and ha'adama. We've learned that you go by the bracha first should be the more specific bracha, gets precedence. Now, within ha'etz or let's say one fruit is ha'etz and one is ha'adama, you have a fruit or a vegetable in front of you, you want both. Which one should you recite the bracha on? We had an argument. We said the Bahag holds that ha'etz is more specific than ha'adama. Ha'etz is the fruit from a tree, is more specific than a ha'adama, than a vegetable bracha, because the fruit from the tree is more specific bracha, because a ha'adama includes, very inclusive, it includes vegetables and it includes fruits from a tree as well. So because of that, the bracha ha'etz would be more specific. That was the Bahag's opinion. And the other views said, no, not necessarily is their preference here, because it's slightly more specific. It's not exactly that much more specific. And it's only applicable in a case where you recited the wrong bracha, that ha'adama works for ha'etz. So it's not necessarily more specific, and therefore there's an argument if ha'etz comes before ha'adama or not. So here, what does it say in the Seder Birchas Hananin? So it says that if the ha'adama you cherish more, you should recite that bracha first. So cherishing a vegetable over a fruit, you recite the bracha on that vegetable first. That now, if they're equal within cherishing, you cherish both, then you should say the ha'etz before, you should say ha'etz first, even though it's not a full-fledged obligation. And the reason being is that it's better to follow the bahag, because you don't lose anything if you follow it. So if you have a fruit and a vegetable, and you cherish them the same, which bracha should you say? Better to say ha'etz, because you'll get that other view, the bahag's view, but it's not a chiyuv gomer. You're not obligated to do it. So if you want to be extra careful, if you want to do that, you can fulfill the view of the bahag and say the ha'etz first, and then you'll be reciting a bracha on a possibly more specific bracha first, but it's not a full-fledged obligation, meaning we don't fully follow this opinion of the bahag that ha'etz comes before ha'adama. Now, we for sure don't follow him if you cherish the ha'adama more than the ha'etz, because cherishing does play a role here, and you recite the bracha on the item you cherish first before the item that you before the ha'etz, and this would, right? Okay, yes, Susan.
Okay, I cherish potatoes and I cherish oranges.
Right.
Both.
So if you have an orange and a potato in front of you, which one do you cherish more?
They're equal. I like.
Okay. Right. So what should you do? Which one should you recite?
What should I recite?
Right. So what did we say?
You said what you cherish.
And if you cherish both equally, then what?
I don't know.
Oh, well, we said that it's better to say ha'etz first.
On the fruit.
Better to do that, but
Better.
It's not an obligation. Okay.
But there's no obligation?
You're not obligated to eat the ha'etz first, but it's better to.
Okay.
Better to recite the bracha on the ha'etz first.
Okay.
Now, if you have the 7 species, now, and the brachas are equal. Now it gets more complicated. So you have, one of them is the 7 species, and the brachas are equal, the same bracha. So, and the other item is a shalem, is complete, but the 7 species is the 7 species, but the other item is complete. Which one should you recite the bracha on? And what about if the other one you cherish more? So if you cherish the other one, and this one is the 7 species, so in that case, you recite the bracha on whichever one you want. If you cherish them equally, and one of them is from the 7 species, you recite it on the 7 species. Now, if the 7 species is half, is cut, and the other one is a complete one, you still recite the bracha on the 7 species. So what comes out from here is 7 species and chaviv is equal. That's equal. But 7 species does take precedence over a shalem, over something that's complete. Now, what happens if the brachas are not the same? And one of them is from the 7 species. So So you have two separate brachas. One of them is from the 7 species. This is really the Gemara that we learned. It's bringing back memories of this Ula's opinion. In other words, do the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda disagree? If you remember the Gemara, we had different opinions. We had 2 opinions. Do the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda disagree in a case where the brachas are different, or do they only disagree in a case where the brachas are the same? And then it left it vague. Well, what would they hold if the brachas are different? Then what? Who agrees to who? Right? You remember that? We don't know who agrees to who. The Gemara left it very ambiguous what to do. Like it just says, in that case, everyone agreed. Here, is where the argument is. But in the other case, everyone agrees. Everyone agrees to who? Who? The rabbis agree to Rabbi Yehuda? Does Rabbi Yehuda agree to the rabbis? So this is exactly what we're dealing with over here. And what comes out is that if the brachas are different, and you need to recite the bracha on each of them, of course, because they're different brachas, then you would recite the bracha on the one you cherish more. Even if it's not the 7 species one. Even if it's ha'adama. So you cherish the 7 species. You cherish, or not the 7 species. You cherish the one you cherish more. You recite the bracha on, even if it's the ha'adama. So let's say you have chickpeas, and you cherish chickpeas. You like them a lot. So you would recite the bracha on the chickpeas more than the date, if you cherish it more. Even though it's ha'adama, but you cherish it more, and even though the date is from the 7 species. So here you have 2 separate brachas. You go by what you cherish more. And that would mean that Rabbi Yehuda agrees to the rabbis. Now, what happens if you cherish them the same? Now, if you cherish them the same, so you have a fruit from the 7 species and a vegetable that's not from the 7 species, and you cherish them the same. So the law is that you could recite whichever one you want. So what we see is that we don't really follow the 7 species rule when it comes to brachas on different brachas. We really only follow the 7 species when it's the same bracha, which one you should recite the bracha on. But when it comes to different items, different brachas, so then we don't give precedence really to the 7 species. You could really recite the bracha on whichever one you want, as long as they're both equal, that you cherish them equally. But of course, as we mentioned earlier, it's better to recite the bracha on the ha'etz before the ha'adama. Now, so what comes out is, what do we follow? If the brachas are different, you go by what you cherish. That is the main thing. You go by what you cherish. If you cherish them equally, then better to do ha'etz before ha'adam. Now, if the brachas are the same, what did we say?
Which is closer to the it's.
One second, we didn't do if both of them are within the 7 species. That's the next thing. That's the next case. The next case is both food items are both from the 7 species. That's the next thing. Here we just mentioned if one is from the 7 species and one is totally different. And the example I gave was you have chickpeas and a date, and you cherish the chickpeas more. You should recite the bracha on the chickpeas. Now, if they're the same bracha and you have an apple and dates, so in that case, we said that you recite it on whichever one you want, because one you cherish and the other one is from the 7 species. So basically, it's whichever one you want, that's what you can recite the bracha on. Which is interesting that we don't follow the tell you have to recite the bracha on the chaviv. Instead, we say you recite the bracha on whichever one you want. Yes, Susan.
Is coffee considered a grain or
Shahakol.
liquid?
The bracha, it's a liquid. It's shahakol, and
Okay.
there wouldn't be any so we already said that you would give precedence to a fruit or a vegetable over a shahakol because the bracha is more specific. So
Right.
first we would go by those brachas, then we would go by, then after that we generally go by different brachas. We would go by what is you cherish more, and then if you cherish them equally, then you would go by the 7 species, even if the other one is a shalem is complete.
Okay.
7 species overrides shalem. Now, then comes the case that Ezra was mentioning, and that was the case that we learned right now in the Gemara. We have the 7 species themselves. Which one overrides the other one? So it says each one, as we learned, that it goes by whatever's earlier in the verse. And you would give them precedence if they're equal in what you cherish. But if a later one you cherish more, then you can recite the bracha on whatever you want. So what comes out is in a case where you cherish one of the 7 species more than the earlier 7 species, you really don't have to go by the 7 species. You could also go by what you cherish. You could do either one. You have both options in front of you. Now, what about mezainos, the bracha on cake, something made from wheat or barley, versus something from a tree, fruit tree, or eights. So of course, wheat comes before barley, fruits come before whatever's earlier in the verse. But with regard to the wheat, so if you made a cake out of it or bread out of it, so then it would take precedence. The wheat would come before the barley. Now, what about, or the wheat would come before the fruits, because even if you like the fruits more, the bracha would take precedence. Now, what about wheat or barley that's not made into cake? You're just going to recite a ho'adam. You have kernels of wheat, and so in this case, if it would basically go back to what we said earlier, that where you have different brachas, and you would recite the bracha on the one that you cherish more. And so we don't care what you cherish if it's mezainos. If it's mezainos, then you recite the bracha on that first. But if it's ho'adama, meaning if it's not made into cake or bread, then you would recite the bracha on what you cherish more. Even though it's ho'adama, you go by what you cherish. So what comes out is we give a lot of precedence to what you cherish, but the 7 species do play a role if you cherish them equally. and you should recite the bracha on what's earlier in the verse. And mezainis does come before the ha'etz or ha'adama. And not only on wheat or barley, mezainis, but on anything, even on spelt or rye, if you recite a mezainis, that bracha would come first. So there's preference to the brachas that really overrides 7 species and what you cherish. The first thing is the mezainis bracha. That overrides the others. Then comes, we said, what you cherish, and then comes the 7 species. Now, the Alter Rebbe also says that an olive will come before a sa'ira, but a chita would come before a zayas. So the Alter Rebbe over here in the Seder Berch Zanen, and he's following what Tosfos said, that when you have a difference between chita, wheat, and an olive, both of them are one step away from the word eretz. So what do you follow? So we said you go by the first eretz. It's next, it says chita. So you would recite the bracha on chita before you would recite the bracha on the, before you would cite the bracha on the olive. Now, what it seems like is that the mezainis on that you recite on spelt, what happens if you have mezainis that's spelt and you have an olive that it says clearly in the verse, and it's the first one from, or how about mezainis, better case, you have mezainis that is from rye or oats, and you have an olive that's the first word after eretz. So in this scenario, it says that the olive would come first. Wow. It comes even before barley. If you like them equally, then it would come first. Now, so normally mezainis comes before anything that's ha'etz. This is something very unique. We're learning something very special over here, that that normally everything mezainis always comes before ha'etz and ha'adama. But here is one scenario where you have either spelt mezainis, you have oats or rye, and the fact is that that we're saying that the olive would actually come before the rye because it's first, and and the olive would come before barley because it is first from the word eretz, and barley is second, and it would actually take precedence over barley if you have mezainis made from barley. It would and it comes before, of course, for sure, oats and rye because it says it's the first in the 7 species, assuming that you cherish them both equally. This is a very unique. This is very a unique law that even though it's mezainis, this is going to come first. Whatever comes first in the verse would take precedence. Now, what it's not clear here is what about it leaves it implies that it leaves it a little vague. What would happen if you have spelt versus zayas versus olive? Spelt mezainis versus an olive. Wheat mezainis would come before an olive. Barley mezainis would come after an olive. An olive would come first. What about spelt? Leaves it vague. It could be it's unclear what the halacha would be. Okay, so this gives us at least a little clarity on the halachas of what we've been speaking about and how it develops into halacha. Yes, Ezra.
Okay. The other three items. Right now, you only have two of them that are spelled out as far as wheat and barley. The other three, we say that they come from.
They're included.
They're included.
Yeah.
But they're not spelled out.
Right. Correct. And that's why they don't have. Yeah.
And therefore, wouldn't spelt, because it's not spelled out, would be number 2 in comparison to the olive.
So the problem is,
you would say the olive first, and then spelt would be afterwards.
I don't know if it's definite, and I'll tell you why. Maybe I'm not. I can't say you're wrong, but this is the thing. The olive has one negative factor to it. It's next to the second eretz. And the wheat is next to the first eretz. So the wheat for sure comes before the olive. Now comes spelt. Spelt is like in the category of the first of the wheat next to the first eretz. On the other hand, doesn't say it clearly, but it is next to the first eretz. It's in the category of the first eretz, and olive is next to the second eretz, but it does say it explicitly. So you have one positive factor and one negative factor to each of them. You get what I'm saying? The olive has the negative factor that it's only next to the second eretz. The spelt is within the category of chita, which is next to the first eretz, but it doesn't say it explicitly. So that's why I'm leaving. It seems to me it's a little up in the air, like that is a little unclear.
But couldn't you learn out from the fact that because the others which are not explicitly stated, and that's the reason why we say that the olive takes precedence.
It seems to me that you're correct, but I don't want to say it for sure, because it in other words, if you read this, it gives that implication that the olive maybe would come before Kusman. So I'm leaning to say that you're right. I just can see it. I could see the other option as well. And I'm forgetting if I saw something about that. I think I did see something in the back of the Gemara here about this case. Again, I'm reading from the Code of Law, but within the commentaries, I'm trying to remember if I saw a case of Kusman, which is spelt. Yeah, I don't remember. Maybe I didn't see anything about it. Yeah, I'm not sure I saw something. Anyway, it leaves it a drop vague, and I'm not sure what to say. That's a good question. If spelt is before an olive. Yes, Ben.
I don't know, but I feel that not being mentioned is a bigger deficiency than being next to the second eretz.
That's what Ezra seems to say. So you got to vote, Ezra. Ben seems to agree with you. and I'm leaning that way as well. So, but it just the way he writes it, he gives it like a little sense of unclarity, which maybe means that it's not 100% clear, and maybe there's both options. Okay, so now that we have gone over some of the halachas about the food items, I don't know if anyone wants to eat anything anymore because it's so complicated. Figuring out which one should I do. Just eat one thing and that's it. But it is interesting that that there is such emphasis on the what you cherish more, and that's the opinion of the rabbis, that they follow what you cherish more than the 7 species. And what it seems like is because you're going to have more kavanah, more intent when you're happier, you're saying it with more, you're reciting the bracha with more joy, with more concentration. That seems to override even the 7 species, or at least it's equal to it in some scenarios, or overrides it. Okay, so we're going to go back to the Gemara, and we're going to start the next little piece, even though we really don't have much time. But let's start the next Gemara here. The next Gemara, we're on 41b, and 41b, we are going to start by the 2 dots, Itmar. The 2 dots, it must be about 12 lines down from the top. Itmar, it was said in the Beis Medrash that people were in the middle of eating a meal. And they brought before them figs and grapes in the midst of the meal. And the question is, do you recite the bracha? And this is really complicated Gemara because it deals with when do you recite a bracha in the middle of a meal, and what does the challah, or the bread, cover? And this question especially comes up on Pesach, because what happens on Pesach? We recite a bracha after we wash. We recite after we wash for bread. What bracha do we recite? After we wash for bread, before we wash for bread, we recite a ho'adama on the karpas, and we say the Barley pri hagofen. And after we wash for bread, this is the thing. Why do I say this? Because when you recite the bracha Barley pri ho'adama on the karpas, what does it say? You're supposed to have in mind the maror that you're going to eat later. Right? You're going to eat the bitter herbs later in the meal. Now, is that understood? Why are you having in mind the bitter herbs that you're going to have during the meal when you recite this bracha on the karpas before you wash? Isn't the bitter herbs included in the meal? Right? You said amaitzi. So the bitter herbs should be included. Why are you having in mind the bitter herbs? And you're having in mind the koref. Why isn't that all included in the? Why aren't the bitter herbs included in the meal? And the answer is that we're going to learn here that not necessarily is everything you think should be included is included. Again, most people think that you recite a bracha hamoitzi, it covers everything. I'm all covered. I don't have to recite any more brachas. It's not exactly true. Even within the meal. Number one, if they bring wine to the table, if this is not a Shabbos meal where you had kiddush, so they bring wine to the table, first thing is you're going to have to recite a bracha on wine or grape juice. That's number one. They bring wine to the table, you recite the bracha. they bring fruit to the table. Is fruit part of the meal? Is that really part of a meal, fruit? Again, you're eating a cream cheese sandwich. The cream cheese, I understand, is part of the meal, part of the bread. You know, it's part. Or a peanut butter sandwich. The peanut butter is covered. But what about the other foods that are within the meal? So we think that when you wash, anyone that's familiar with the tradition of washing and reciting the grace after meal and reciting the hamaitzi, so we always think, during the meal we have no issues of brachas. It's not so clear. And now we're going to see some cases like this where it deals with it. Itmar, we learned, it was mentioned, it was said in the Beis Medrash, they brought before them figs and grapes in the meal. Amar Rav Huna says, to unim bracha lefneim, they need a bracha ha'etz before you eat them. They are not considered part of the meal. Ve'ein to a bracha lachreim, but you don't need to recite a bracha after eating them. What bracha would you recite if you needed to recite a bracha after eating dates and grapes? It would be the long paragraph called the Al Ha'etz. Bracha achas mi'ein shalosh. That would be the bracha. And it says you don't have to say the after bracha, which means that Birkas Hamazon, grace after meal, is going to exempt these fruits, but the Hamaitzi is not going to exempt these fruits. So you have to recite a bracha before you eat them, but you don't have to recite a bracha after you eat them because the grace after meal will cover the after bracha. Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman agrees with Rav Huna. Rav Nachman said the same thing. Rav Nachman says, you need a bracha before, but you do not need a bracha after. One of the things that we're going to be discussing in this Gemara is what happens when they bring melon. Some places you go to the Shabbos table, they wash hamaitzi.
Okay.
Let me just mute everyone here. 1 second. Some people, you go to their Shabbos table. What do they have on the Shabbos table? A piece of cantaloupe on every person's place setting. And after they recite Kiddush and they make hamaitzi, what do they have? Cantaloupe. Is that cantaloupe considered part of the meal? Or not? Then comes, of course, the cantaloupe at the end of the meal. What about the dessert cantaloupe? Is that cantaloupe part of the meal? Is one yes, one not? Or are they both the same category? Do they both fall into the same? So these are the things, some of the things we're going to be discussing. And I must tell you that it is complicated Gemara and different opinions. But we have here Rav Huna and Rav Nachman both saying that when they brought these these figs and grapes in the meal, they said you have to recite a bracha before, but you do not have to recite a bracha afterwards. Rav Sheshes Amar, Rav Sheshes says, "Tuna bracha ben lefneim ben lachreim." He says you need to recite a bracha before it or after it. Neither the hamaitzi nor the grace after meal nor the birkas hamazon, neither of them exempt these fruits. So you, according to Rav Sheshes, you must recite a bracha before and after.
Rebbe, when you say exempt, you mean cover them. They don't exempt them, they cover them.
Thank you for correcting my wording. Right? They include them.
I'm saying, I'm trying to understand.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's a better wording. You're right. They cover them.
It includes them. So
it includes them. It covers them. That's a better. Thank you for correcting me. That is correct. And I should be more exact. So the bracha, according to Rav Sheshes, the bracha of hamaitzi and the bracha of birchas hamazon does not cover the fruits that they bring during the meal. She'ein lecha davar shato and bracha lefanav ve'ein ton bracha liacharav, because there is nothing that needs a bracha before it but doesn't need a bracha after it. Ella, rather, only pas haba bekisnin belvad. Only pas haba bekisnin, which we will translate as I guess the best way of translating it is a type of cake. And that's the only thing that would need a bracha before eating it, but would not need a bracha after eating it. Anything else, if it needs a bracha before, it's going to need a bracha afterwards. This is Rav Shesh's view. Again, Rav Nachman and Rav Huna both said that you could have things that need a bracha, require a bracha before, but do not require a bracha after, because grace after meal covers them. But Rav Sheshes argues. Rav Sheshes says there's only one thing that would need a bracha before eating it during a meal, but would not need a bracha afterwards, and that would be, it's a type of bread, but it's like a cake, so it's pasa b'kisnin bovad, and that would be a case where you recite a bracha before, but you do not recite a bracha afterwards. Now, Rashi says that the uniqueness about pasa b'kisnin is, now this is Rashi's view, that pasa b'kisnin is that something you really eat after a meal, but it does not require an after blessing. And Rashi says that after they would say the Berchas Hamazon, they would bring them kernels and bread with them, kernels of like wheat or grain, and they're supposed to be good for the heart. They would bring bread with them that was mixed, it was kneaded with spices, and they make different design on this bread, and people only eat a little amount of it. And because they put so many spices in it, and they put nuts in it, and almonds, so you only eat a little of it. You do not need to recite a bracha afterwards, but you do need to recite a bracha before it. And there is a whole discussion, according to the way Rashi is learning this, does that mean you do not recite a Barley Nefashis either? Or does it mean you do recite a Barley Nefashis afterwards? Because we've had cases where it says you don't need a bracha afterwards, but you do need to say a Barley Nefashis. So there is a discussion in Rashi. Again, Rashi is giving his view of what this means, pasa b'kisnin. This is not the common view. There are numerous commentaries here. It's not, Rashi's view is not the one accepted in Shulchan Aruch, but there are three views what pasa b'kisnin is. And I will just tell you them before we conclude. And that is that there is a view that pasa b'kisnin is what we call mezainis bread. Mezainis bread is bread that has the majority of other liquids besides water. So if you could mix your flour with, instead of water, you mix it with apple juice, not from concentrate. So now you have the majority apple juice of the liquid, the majority of liquid in your bread is made with apple juice. So that would be a case of pas haba b'kisnin. It's called bread, but it's called bread that comes with, it's called bread that's ba'a b'kisnin. And I'm not sure how to translate b'kisnin because based on these different opinions, they probably translate it differently, but it means something to do with the fact that it's kneaded with, according to this view, this is the Rambam's view, it's kneaded with other liquids that are not majority water. Another view is that it was pockets, and kisnin could mean pockets, that there's a pocket inside this bread, and you have a large amount of flavoring in that pocket of fruits and other stuff. So for example, this could be considered like a, maybe a babka, or like you have inside it, maybe like a Danish, that, but it's specifically referring to a Danish that has pleasuresome food inside the pocket, but it's more like a bread.
Jelly roll that
the
looks
dough,
like a challah.
the dough would be more like a bread. In other words, made with water, not the Danishes that we have today. The Danish is half oil, or more than, who knows what they put in it, but it's not majority water as far as I know. It's like a cake mixture. And cake mixtures have less than the majority of all the liquid water is less than the majority. The oil, there's more oil than water. If there is any water, so the
Fruit juice.
What is that? Fruit juice.
Fruit juice.
Maybe, right. But ultimately, the opinion that I'm mentioning here is that it's like a bread that has pockets of flavoring or of fruits or other, enjoyable, pleasurable foods.
A jelly
in the pocket.
Danish.
Like a pita bread that you would have, like almost like a pita that has Danish filling in it, that has chocolate in it or something else. That's another opinion. And then there's a third opinion that pasabah b'kisnin means something like a pretzel, something hard that you crunch on. And these are the different opinions of what pasabah b'kisnin is. What we're going to see is that it's really a bread. And it's not so simple to recite a mezainis on mezainis rolls. I know they sell them in the stores and they make a lot of money on these mezainis rolls because people think that they don't have to wash when they eat a mezainis roll. But as we'll soon see, it's not simple at all. These three opinions of what the mezainis, what cases are really mezainis and what aren't. And like, for example, the opinion that holds that the pasabah b'kisnin is a pocket would hold that mezainis rolls are not mezainis. Just because you mixed in apple juice, that doesn't make it mezainis. They would hold it's hamaitzi. And the other opinion that holds that because you mixed apple juice, majority apple juice, the dough is majority apple juice, that makes it mezainis. They would hold that the case of the pocket that has pleasuresome fruits and other flavors inside the pocket, that would be hamaitzi. So each one seems to argue with the other one, and then you have the third view that says only that the only thing that's mezainis is something that's crunchy. So, bottom line is that we have this Gemara here that it mentions pas habab kisnin is something that would need a bracha before and not after. And the way Rashi learned is that this pas habab kisnin learns a whole different explanation of what pas habab kisnin is. And as I mentioned, he holds that it's a type of bread that you ate together with kernels, and the bread, you only eat a drop of it, and it's not talking about during a meal. And it's very spicy. It has a lot of flavor from spices, tavlin, different spices in it. And you only eat a drop of it. That would be a case of pas habab kisnin. And again, not the other opinions don't agree with Rashi. And to be continued tomorrow, Bez Hashem. Yes, Ben.
I wanted to say the only one that I know that's called bread and has almonds in it is mandelbrot.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And it's
That's
baked
it.
in a loaf, really, and sliced. So
The only thing is, mandelbrot we eat a lot of. And Rashi says this, you hardly eat any of.